From the birth of partition in 1921 to the fall of Stormont in 1972, 6 men held the post of Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. All were leaders of unionism, each personified a particular role as Prime Minister. From Craig, the state builder, Andrews, the ageing caretaker, Brooke, the loyalist squire, O'Neill, the aristocratic reformer, Chichester Clark, the dutiful officer, to Faulkner, the pragmatic hardliner. Unionists in Northern Ireland have had mixed feelings about these men, ranging from deep reverence through ambivalence to contempt. On the other hand, Northern nationalists have, on the whole, regarded them all as the unlovely embodiment of a deeply detested regime. But who were these 6 partly forgotten and still divisive leaders? For most of the people of Northern Ireland, whatever their political choices, these remain largely unknown figures. My name is Alvin Jackson. As an historian, I've written and lectured on Ireland, and Northern Ireland in particular, for over 30 years. In this series, I'm going to reveal the stories of these 6 men who, for better or worse, have left their indelible mark on the North's troubled history. I'm going to reveal the critical moments that defined their time in office, and I'll examine the decisions that they made that shaped the history of Northern Ireland throughout the 20th century. Having led the North's contribution to the Allied war effort, and with peace restored in Europe in 1945, the man now in charge of navigating Northern Ireland through calmer waters was Sir Basil Brooke. He served as Prime Minister for nearly 20 years. Amongst Unionists, he commanded respect and loyalty as a man dedicated to the unity of their party and to the institutions of partition. Yet for nationalists, he came to epitomise the privileged world of big house unionism. Basil Stanlake Brooke was born and grew up in the grand surroundings of Colebrook Park, the ancestral home of his family, in rural County Fermanagh. I've come to find out more about Brooke's military service in the First World War from his grandson.
So this is your grandfather in Hussars uniform, is that right?
Yes, he was a Fusilier to begin with. He actually got bored and he decided that it would be far better and more comfortable to have a horse. He got Military Cross, and that was for continuous service and acts of bravery. And in fact, it was Gallipoli, but it was a combination of that and being in France. There's a history of military in the family. It is supposed that 23 Brookes from Colebrook fought in the 2 World Wars and 18 were killed.
You visited your grandfather in Stormont during his period as Prime Minister. Perhaps you would share with us some of your memories of that visit and experience.
We had great fun there because we were allowed to run around the corridors, not only of Stormont House, but Stormont Castle. And wherever we went with my grandparents, there were always, sadly, policemen. But I think the policemen liked the diversion of 2 or 3 children who would ambush them round the corners and throw water at them out of buckets and so on. So Stormont was a place of fun for us. I am incredibly proud of my ancestors. It doesn't matter what politician you talk about. There is something called an opposition, and they will always think differently. And if you expect me to say anything other than we loved our grandparents and we think that they did the best that they could at the time in the circumstances that were there, I've said it, and that's what I'll say.
As Prime Minister, Basil Brooke had overseen the introduction of the National Health Service to Northern Ireland in 1948, and he had received solid guarantees of Northern Ireland's constitutional position within the United Kingdom through the 1949 Ireland Act. The future of partition and of Northern Ireland now appeared secure. This effectively represented the high watermark of Ulster Unionism. As a personal expression of his security and standing, in 1952, Brooke was given a peerage by Winston Churchill's government, making him Viscount Brookborough. A year later, he proudly hosted Queen Elizabeth II, only a month after her coronation, on her first state visit to Northern Ireland. Yet, under the surface, tensions were real. The majority of nationalists were aggrieved and discontent in the north. Many of them deeply disliked Brooke because of his uncompromising loyalism, and in particular because of a deeply controversial speech he gave in the summer of 1933. Delivered here in the Fermanagh border village of Newton Butler at an Orange Order event, he said that there were a great number of Protestants and Orangemen who employed Roman Catholics. He claimed he could speak freely on this subject as he did not have a Roman Catholic about his own place, and he appealed to loyalists, wherever possible, to employ good Protestant lads and lassies. Later in his career, Brooke sought to explain and even to repudiate these sentiments. But nationalist outrage was deep and it was lasting, and it has resonated down the years to the present day. Like Craig and Andrews before him, Brooke equated Catholicism and nationalism with disloyalty and with the subversion of the Northern Ireland that he had sought to shape. For Brooke, his suspicions of nationalist disloyalty appeared to be borne out in December 1956, when the IRA launched another effort to end partition with a series of armed raids on police stations and other targets along the border. Brooke spoke on the BBC in London to explain how he saw the situation.
Now, what is this IRA, this Irish Republican Army?
Well, the IRA, I'm not in their councils. I can't give you a very detailed account of it. But the IRA are really the militant side of Sinn Féin. They are a body of men who stick at nothing. They consider that they will accomplish their ends by murder and threats and damage to property. And all I want to assure my viewers, I think that is the right word, I want to assure my viewers that an Ulsterman does not give way to threats. He does not give way to damage or outrages. He is firmly determined to remain part of the United Kingdom, and nothing will shift him.
On New Year's Day 1957, the IRA attacked the police station here in the Fermanagh village of Brookborough, 4 miles from the Brooke family home at Colebrook. The attackers were repelled by the local police, and 2 IRA men were killed in what was one of the most bloody and dramatic confrontations in the entire border campaign. Yet, 2 years later, faced with a lack of support from Northern nationalists and with internment operating on both sides of the border, the IRA campaign ended in failure. Though the close of the IRA's border campaign marked a personal victory for Brooke, he would have other battles to fight. By now, Unionist Party colleagues were becoming fiercely critical over what they saw as his indifference to a mounting economic crisis. One of the most sneering dismissals of Brooke came from the Finance Minister, Terence O'Neill, who quipped that people thought, Brooke spent a lot of time relaxing away from his desk. But what they didn't realise, he said, is that there was no desk. Brooke grew up in an Edwardian world. His political formation took place against the backdrop of the Unionist struggle against Home Rule and Irish independence. The 1960s were for Brooke a strange and an unfamiliar location. Northern Ireland's economy was in freefall as the traditional pillars of Ulster industry, shipbuilding and linen production were in sharp decline. By March 1963, Basil Brooke had been Prime Minister of Northern Ireland for nearly 20 years. Approaching the age of 75, and with his health failing, he was persuaded to retire. In the end, the truth may be that Brooke simply did not recognise that there was inequality in Northern Ireland. Inequality that required redress, inequality that required reform. The new Prime Minister of Northern Ireland was Terence O'Neill. But with the economy in crisis and the need to tackle inequality while maintaining Unionist unity, he faced a daunting task. And he did so in a world where big house unionism could no longer count on the old loyalties. Compared with Basil Brooke's old-fashioned country squire image, Terence O'Neill seemed better equipped for the challenges of the new decade. He was younger, he was energetic, he represented a break with the old unionism, and he believed that he had the solution to Northern Ireland's problems: economic modernisation.
What an asset it would be if we were to establish throughout Great Britain and beyond the name for fine design, excellent craftsmanship, and unassailable standards.
His vision was to open up Northern Ireland to the world, to revitalise and transform the economy. He rolled out plans for major new roads, a new university, new towns, and persuaded international brands and major global companies to open factories, like Michelin, who brought a massive-scale factory here to Ballymena. Determined he may have been, but the question was, could O'Neill be different to the prime ministers who had preceded him? He was the son of a wealthy aristocratic family from County Antrim.
I see the Unionist Party as the only instrument able to adapt Ulster.
Schooled at Eton, he served in the Irish Guards during the Second World War. Once again, Unionists had embraced a former army officer as their Prime Minister. O'Neill believed that economic growth, modernisation and above all jobs, that these would change the face of Northern Ireland and change its politics as well. O'Neill hoped that more jobs would reclaim working-class Protestant votes which had been lost to the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and at the same time entice Northern nationalists closer to the Union. Despite their suspicions, O'Neill seemed to be sending out the right signals to the nationalist community, and he was about to go further than any Prime Minister before him. In 1965, O'Neill felt compelled to take a momentous decision, one which, in his words, would break Northern Ireland out of the chain of fear. And for him, what this meant in practice was extending an invitation to the Irish Taoiseach to come north to Stormont for a meeting. This was the first time in 40 years that a Northern Premier had met his Southern counterpart. On the 14th of January 1965, Sean Lemass arrived outside Parliament buildings, where he was greeted by Terence O'Neill. The moment marked a dramatic thaw in North-South relations.
Well, relations have been distant from 1925, from the South's point of view, unsatisfactory resolution of the Boundary Commission. Both jurisdictions officially attempted to ignore one another, and in particular periods, Dublin attempted to end partition. So you could characterise the relationship as cold, that there's some cooperation below the surface, but there's very little really going on.
So on the face of it, Lemass and O'Neill are very, very different personalities. What was the basis for their relationship?
O'Neill is an aberrant and very unusual Ulster Unionist. Lemass is, on one level, a typical Dublin Republican, but perhaps a Dublin Republican of the kind not characterised in the history books. He's urban, he plays cards, he's good company, he's a kind of shrewd, almost businessman. He's a moderniser. So again, he's not typical of the caricature of Fianna Fáil at that time. What O'Neill and Lemass share in common is respective understandings that the jurisdictions over which they preside are in degrees of difficulty. O'Neill has not prepared the ground for this meeting. He has not brought a body of his ministers in to understand what he's doing. At cabinet level, it's not clearly understood where he's going, nor does he communicate this publicly. Now, the liberal unionist press, close allies of his, people like Ken Bloomfield, the little elite circle he moved in, they understood what he was doing. But for the wider public, it was open to misrepresentation. So it marks an initial deep fissure for O'Neill.
O'Neill's meeting with Lemass enraged right-wing unionists like the Reverend Ian Paisley, the firebrand preacher who was positioning himself as the fundamentalist heir of both Carson and the other unionist leaders of the Home Rule era.
Captain O'Neill represents himself as the Cassius Clay of the Unionist Party, the greatest ever Prime Minister of Ulster. This, of course, is utter rubbish and nonsense.
But for many nationalists, O'Neill had offered rhetoric and symbolism rather than substance. This was still more than his predecessors had done. Yet the catalysts and the pressures for change in Northern Ireland were now coming from outside of his government, and events were moving at a very rapid pace indeed, quicker than O'Neill could act and quicker than he could keep up with. By the late 1960s, the long-standing grievances and discontent within the nationalist community found expression in the rise of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And, inspired by the new age of protest, resistance and youthful revolution, they took to the streets. One of the central concerns of the civil rights movement was discrimination in housing provision for Catholics. Here, in Londonderry, gerrymandering, the manipulation of electoral districts to guarantee unionist control, ensured that houses were often allocated to Protestants over Catholics. On the 5th of October 1968, the civil rights campaign reached a critical moment when a protest in Derry, banned by the police, went ahead and ended in a violent confrontation. Images of baton-wielding policemen assaulting unarmed demonstrators were broadcast around the world. It would be looked back upon by some as the day the Troubles began. One of the civil rights leaders in Derry at the time was Eamon McCann.
Until October 1968, the entire idea of politics in Northern Ireland was that Catholic people voted Green, that Protestant people voted Orange, and that was to be the case forevermore. In retrospect, it may seem fanciful, but those of us who set out at the beginning of 1968 to create the civil rights movement had it in mind that we wanted to overcome the sectarian division, not to continue sort of conventional history, but to overcome history. Nevertheless, the main significance of October the 5th, looking back on it now, is that it opened a crack. It was a key moment in opening a crack in the Unionist monolith, and everything else poured through after that.
In the past, Eamon, you've written a little bit about Terence O'Neill. What's your view of O'Neill after 50 years?
My impression of O'Neill is that he was a decent sort of a fellow. He had become the leader of the Unionist Party, but wanted sort of to lead the Unionist Party in a way which wasn't deeper into the orange trough. I don't think O'Neill understood sectarian politics, despite the fact that he was the leader of the Unionist Party. That was set for disaster to have a Unionist leader who didn't understand the nature of the politics of Northern Ireland. I think, in retrospect, Terence O'Neill was a reformer, that he did want to change Northern Ireland and did realise that if Northern Ireland didn't change, and specifically if Unionism didn't change, disaster awaited. I think that O'Neill genuinely understood that and genuinely felt that. O'Neill made gestures, and no doubt they were well meant, but for an awful lot of others in the Catholic working class areas, it was too little too late.
Under pressure from the street protests and from London, O'Neill introduced a package of reforms, including a fairer allocation of council housing and the creation of a development commission for Derry. But fearful of further protests, he also prepared a State of the Nation broadcast. His private secretary, Ken Bloomfield, accompanied him to the television studios.
Well, I'd worked very hard in the office to put a speech together and went down to Broadcasting House. This is the autocue for that speech. Everybody remembers the opening remark, Ulster stands at the crossroads. It isn't on this bit of paper. It had actually been used in an earlier speech, and at the very last moment, O'Neill decided to say it again before he got onto this great screed that I had written.
The Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Captain the Right Honourable Terence O'Neill.
Ulster stands at the crossroads. I believe you know me well enough by now to appreciate that I am not a man given to extravagant language. But I must say to you this evening that our conduct over the coming days and weeks will decide our future.
For me, there's a really sharp contrast here. The contrast is between style and substance. The speech reads as a carefully modulated plea for moderation, an appeal for cool heads at a time of mounting crisis. The difficulty lies with the presentation of the speech. O'Neill's somewhat condescending tones.
I would be failing in my duty to you as your Prime Minister if I did not put the issues calmly and clearly.
He comes across for me as what many people at the time said he was, an excessively shy man, on this occasion acting out a role.
What kind of Ulster do you want? A happy and respected province, or a place continually torn apart by riots and demonstrations and regarded by the rest of Britain as a political outcast? As always in a democracy, the choice is yours.
Immediately after the speech, there was a real sense of euphoria. People knew what he stood for, and you know, I'm backing O'Neill. This was the great slogan, I'm backing O'Neill. So lots of people were backing O'Neill. And yet into the new year, of course, it all fell to pieces again.
By the end of 1968, a new and more radical organisation had emerged from the civil rights movement. People's Democracy, which was spearheaded by leaders such as Bernadette Devlin, demanded more radical reforms than the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association.
We did not come on this march looking for trouble. We came on this march to make clear that the situation in Northern Ireland has not changed and that the words of Captain Terence O'Neill recently did not change anything in Northern Ireland.
On the 4th of January 1969, a People's Democracy march, which had set off from Belfast, bound for Derry, reached the village of Claudy. As the demonstrators approached Burntollet Bridge, they were violently ambushed by loyalist extremists and off-duty members of the Ulster Special Constabulary, with some marchers jumping into the river in a desperate attempt to escape. The Burntollet March proved a fatal moment for O'Neill. Along with the radical challenge of People's Democracy, he now felt intense pressure from right-wing unionists, inside and outside his party, who were opposed to his reforms. With no viable middle ground to occupy, O'Neill had simply nowhere to turn. In a desperate attempt to rally support, he called a general election for the 24th of February 1969. O'Neill was challenged for his Safe Bandside constituency seat by Ian Paisley and by Michael Farrell from People's Democracy.
Michael Farrell, 2,310 votes. Terence Marn O'Neill, 7,745 votes. Ian Richard Kyle Paisley, 6,331 votes. I accordingly declare Terence Marn O'Neill duly elected as the representative for the Bandside.
The Prime Minister may have won the election, but the narrow margin left him terminally wounded. For O'Neill, who had spent the evening here at Stormont Castle, exhausted, anxiously awaiting the election results, political humiliation beckoned. He tried to hang on, but as violence escalated in the spring of 1969, so the pressures on him ratcheted up even further.
I'm not going to anticipate what's going to happen. It's a matter for the party to decide.
When will the party meet?
I've no idea.
With no more fight left, he finally admitted defeat, and on the 28th of April 1969, he resigned. But his reforms had proved too much for many Protestants and too little for many Catholics, and his remote and superior manner had not helped his cause.
Terence O'Neill had far more in common with Brooke than he dared to admit. Both were dynastic politicians, both were big house unionists, but fundamentally by 1969, Terence O'Neill was the wrong man with the right ideas.
In the next episode, as violence erupted, I'll examine the dramatic events that led to the fall of two prime ministers and the Stormont government itself.
Brian Faulkner, he felt betrayed by Heath. I certainly did.
Internment was proof to the nationalist community that nothing was changing.